reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity. This is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. It is wonderful, as always, to see you. Hop on in here, join our little community as we take a look at gender diversity together and see if we can understand it in a sort of more evidence-based way than we often see it thought about. And this time, as we do every time we come together, we take a question from a public figure or politician or sometimes a famous book author, and we take their very confident statements for the questions that we know they're intended to be, and we see if we can't look to the literature to find an answer. And this week is no exception. This week we have then Health Secretary, I think, Sajid Javid, talking essentially about gender diversity in the context of conversion therapy. Now, you might know, if you got your ear to the ground, that conversion therapy and the debate about whether or not we are or aren't going to ban it has become something of a contentious issue in the public forum right now, where the Conservative government seems to move backwards and forwards on the question of whether we can complete a ban on conversion therapy, largely because there's a question about whether they want to include transgender folk in that ban, right? Do they want to protect transgender folk from conversion therapy? Now, of course, we've already talked a little bit about things like gender exploratory therapy, which in the sort of most generous cases might be considered just a very useful form of thinking about gender diversity, but could also disguise quite significant conversion therapy attempts or gender change, identity change efforts. These efforts to change somebody's gender identity, conversion therapy, otherwise known as. So, there's been a question. The government isn't quite sure. And when this debate was at its height, we had Sajid Javid talking about one of the reasons why we needed to be cautious about including gender diversity in the, conversion therapy ban. So here is then Health Secretary Sajid Javid.
Well, when it comes to conversion therapy, it is absolutely right, as the government has said, that we ban the so-called conversion therapy for LGBT people. When it comes to trans, I do think that we need to be more careful. You asked me again as Health Secretary. In my mind is the recent report by Dr. Hilary Cash. She's one of the most experienced pediatricians in this country. She just published an interim report just a few weeks ago, and she talked about how children and young people, when they say they have gender dysphoria, it is right for medical experts to be able to question that and to determine what the cause might be. Is it a genuine case of gender identity dysphoria, or could it be that individual is suffering from some child sex abuse, for example, or could it be linked to bullying? So I think it is right to take the approach that we have, which is to ban conversion therapy for LGB, but to take a much more sort of sensitive approach when it comes to trans.
Thanks very much to Sajid Javid for such an interesting question, posed as they often are in the form of reasonably confident declaration. And we're going to try and take this apart a little bit and just focus on one component, because there's quite a bit going on in this statement. I mean, apart from anything else, Sajid Javid talking about, hey, we need to make sure that pediatricians and other doctors and counselors and psychotherapists and psychologists, including our good selves, have the opportunity to ponder the reason why a person might be experiencing gender dysphoria. If there are other reasons for their internal experience that isn't really gender dysphoria, it just kind of looks like it, they need the opportunity to kind of explore those possibilities. But that's not really, that's not the definition of conversion therapy, of course. The definition of conversion therapy is any effort to change somebody's gender identity. So those two things are not the same. So Sajid Javid kind of saying, well, we can't ban conversion therapy because we need to make sure we have people have the opportunity to ponder the reasons why somebody might be dysphoric. is a bit like saying, well, we can't ban cars because planes exist. Those aren't the same thing, Sajid Javid. But hey, we'll take it for the question that we know it was intended to be, and we will ponder it. I do think this is one of the most difficult questions that we have tried to answer at the core, because I don't think there's very much research that looks at like sexual abuse, for example. Apologies, we are going to talk about that very briefly. We're just going to talk about bullying. I think I'm going to focus on bullying today. What he's kind of implying is that gender identities can be shaped by sexual bullying, and sexual bullying can be shaped by sexual assault, and can be shaped by bullying. And that is an interesting question. I couldn't find, whenever we do this, right, I always scour the literature quite deeply. So we publish a bunch of systematic reviews. We have amazing trainee educational psychologists who conduct the systematic reviews, which we supervise. And we've published a bunch of them. And so I can use some of those techniques to gather the information that's relevant here, right? So we take a look at all of the kind of abuse and bullying studies that are conducted on gender diverse populations, around kind of school-age children or slightly older, and even young adults, right? Looking back at their experience in childhood. And I looked through everything I could find. I couldn't find a single study that cross-lagged early childhood sexual abuse or early experiences of bullying with later gender dysphoria. I couldn't find anything. Now, the absence of evidence is not the same as the evidence of absence, right? The fact there's no studies like that look at that question, I mean, in a sense, it'd be a bit ethically dubious to do so, right? But the fact there's no studies that looked at that question and can answer it doesn't necessarily mean that if a study were to look at it, they would find an absence, right? They would find that there's no effect. So it is still possible, but I couldn't find any evidence to support Sajid Javid's direct claim. But I do still think there's an interesting question for us to focus on for this week. And that's the question, I think, Sajid Javid's point that actually these young people are at risk of bullying. And what are the effects of that? And is that something that we should be focusing on? Like, because it can be very difficult. Like, we're talking about young people who are experiencing gender dysphoria. Like, everything that we focus on is gender dysphoria. But actually, are these young folk at risk of bullying and victimization? And does that indicate that we need to do something better to kind of protect them from that? And if so, what can we do here, in modern societies where, adolescence and bullying kind of unfortunately go hand in hand? How do we kind of protect young people from the effects of victimization? How do we, intervene in schools in particular? So I think there's a reasonable question here, and let's take a look at an answer. I think we first start with this great meta-analysis. Like, if you've been here before, I love a good meta-analysis because it reviews this guy's like Myers and colleagues, 2020, the victimization of LGBTQ plus students at school, a meta-analysis in the Journal of School Violence, very cool journal. They gathered 55 different studies and compared the 276 effect size estimates between those studies. So they were able to kind of make huge sweeping claims about, what is the state of victimization for LGBTQ students in school. Now, first off, victimization, I realize, has a kind of very specific meaning in equalities law in the UK. And you might get confused about what victimization refers to when we're talking about these studies. We're going to talk about victimization as very akin to bullying. Essentially, harassment or bullying, that as we would describe it in the UK, is often how these studies describe victimization. Effectively, any kind of incidents of harassment or bullying or hate speech or physical harassment or physical bullying, all covered by the victimization umbrella. So these guys found that LGBTQ identification is a moderate and consistent risk factor for victimization in school. So they found that for all of the young people in these studies, absolutely enormous set of 55 different studies, and they found that the effect size for LGBTQ identification on on the risk of victimization was similar as it was for people who experienced like poor self-control. So there's a sort of interesting feature of the literature, of the bullying literature, that finds that people who have low self-control are at risk for victimization. And the reason is the current kind of prevailing winds of that theory go that the reason is because people who have low kind of self-control may engage in risky behaviors that are like potentially violent behaviors in school, or they react very poorly to victimization, or they might engage in behaviors that are a bit riskier and quite overt, that stand them out as different, and that makes them a target for this kind of victimization in school. What's interesting, of course, is that when you're talking about LGBTQ identification, these folk have a similar risk of victimization, but they don't engage in the kind of behaviors that might stand them out as in the same kind of way. There's no risky associated behavior with being LGBTQ. Just identifying as LGBTQ puts you at risk of being victimized in school. So that's kind of fascinating. It's quite a strong effect. And there's no real explanation except that we know that homophobic bullying is quite strong, as is transphobic bullying. And there is a sort of prevailing theory from Hofarth and Hodson and colleagues highlighting that anti-transgender stigma might be more severe than anti-gay prejudice. And indeed, in this study, we find this big meta-analysis, we find that it's most significant for trans participants. Trans young people were at greater risk of victimization than anyone else, and that people who were questioning were at lower risk than their overtly trans kin, which again, possibly because they're not so apparent and therefore less likely to be sort of targeted for victimization. What's interesting as well is that this study, this big meta-analysis, was primarily in the United States, and they found that the Western states like California, etc., which are mostly considered more liberal states, right, on the western kind of shore of the United States. On the Western end, those guys tend to be a bit more liberal, and the bullying was worse in those states. And again, the authors kind of say, well, they also have policies that might make it more overt that people are gender diverse, because they create contexts in which people who are gender diverse and LGBTQ more broadly can come out more freely. And so the paradoxical effect is that while they create an inclusive environment where people can come out more freely, when people do come out more freely, they are still at risk of victimization in those areas. So while we are good at creating a context where people can be their authentic selves, we're less good at preventing the victimization that being out unfortunately exposes them to. So it seems primarily, this big meta-analysis, Sajid Jav is not wrong, right? Bullying is, being gender diverse is associated with bullying and victimization. Now, why? What are the impacts of that? Well, we might need to reach to Hatchell and colleagues in 2019, Peer Victimization and Suicidality Among LGBTQ Youth. And they look not only at the sort of impact of peer victimization on suicidality. We're going to be talking about that briefly. Bit of a content warning here. I think, honestly, this whole podcast needs to come with just one gigantic content warning because we are constantly talking about very challenging circumstances. It's simply the nature of this research. But they also look at mediating factors, like why would peer victimization have such an impact on people emotionally? Now, their data came from the 2015 Dane County Youth Survey. Now, Dane County is the second most populated county in Wisconsin, and their sample was quite big. So it's 13,905 young people, about 50% male, about 75% white and non-Hispanic, and mean age about 15.8 years in 22 high schools across Dane County. So continuing with our content warning, we are going to be talking a little bit about suicide here. They found that peer victimization was associated with two mediators which connected peer victimization to suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts, with like self-compassion being a big one, and sense of belonging being, of course, the other. The peer victimization was very strongly related, with a moderate effect size to sense of belonging, and then sense of belonging was connected to both suicidal ideation, particularly suicidal ideation, actually, for sense of belonging, and then peer victimization was also connected to a deterioration in self-compassion, which had a strong and significant relationship with suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts to a lesser extent. So essentially, peer victimization, this kind of like persistent bullying that people experienced in schools, was associated with like detriments to both self-compassion and sense of belonging. And as we'll find, I think sense of belonging is going to just keep coming up as the key feature here, and may give us a sense of what we need to do to protect young LGBTQ people in school, provide a strong sense of belonging and strong anti-bullying policies. But we'll come to that. Next up, I wanted to kind of focus on Garth's research. Again, they look at suicidal ideation among transgender and gender-expansive youth, looking at the mechanisms for risk. And it's a really big study. So in 2018, 900 schools participated in their research, which represented 96% of Illinois' counties. Again, this is, for some reason, a lot of this research today comes out of the United States. I don't really know why that has happened, just tends to be where this research gets conducted, I guess. But we'll come to the UK research right at the end when we have some really cool research indicating what we need to do next. So they got like just shy of 200,000 valid surveys from students in grades 8 to 12. And they identified like a huge number even of transgender and non-binary participants. So they didn't describe them as non-binary, they described them as gender expansive. Anybody who did not identify as male or female or transgender. There was like 2,500 people identified as gender expansive. It's about 1.24%. And transgender young people, not unusual, about 1,200 participants, or 0.6%. Again, that 0.6%, 0.5% is about right for the number of transgender people in the population. We keep seeing it. 0.5% came up in the UK survey too very recently. So for these young people, these researchers were particularly interested in the relationship between being either transgender or gender expansive and essentially suicidal ideation. And they were pondering a bunch of potential mediators. And they found, important to our kind of question here, they found that depressive symptoms and victimization partially mediated the association. So basically, they found that to some degree, being transgender and gender expansive was associated with victimization, and then victimization was associated with suicidal ideation. So basically, we just keep, when we look at victimization in particular, the effects of victimization, they were focused on a few other things too, these researchers, but we're particularly interested in bullying and victimization here. When it comes to victimization, we just keep seeing that it's associated with suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts. And at least, in some of this research, it looks like belonging is one of the key factors that leads to that outcome, right? That people have this kind of deleterious effect on belonging from victimization, and that then leads to these kind of very negative outcomes. So apologies again, we're also going to talk a little bit about sexual harassment now as a specific form of victimization that people can experience. Now, Kaltiala and Elonen in 2022, their study called Transgender Identity and Experiences of Sexual Harassment in Adolescence. They conducted a survey among 8th and 9th graders, which is about age 14 to 16 years, and second-year students of upper secondary education, that's upper secondary school and vocational school, which is roughly the age of about 16 to 18. So their study in total covered about 139,000 young people from the age of 14 to 18. And they basically looked at, they were looking at sexual harassment experiences in these young people. Quite young, right? 14 to 18. So that's kind of in the UK, the equivalent of secondary age and sixth form, which is quite, it's quite young. And they were asking them about their experiences of sexual assault, essentially. Now, again, it's interesting, about 95.8% of the population that were sampled here identified as cisgender. 0.6% identified as binary transgender, and about 3.5% identified as non-binary. So, again, that ratio seems really very consistent in a lot of the studies that we keep looking at. Sort of depends on how you define non-binary or gender expansive. Different people define it in different ways, so it kind of ranges from 2.5 to 3.5%. But it tends to be about that area. And gender diverse, transgender folk, 0.5, 0.6% of the population, sitting at 0.6, I think, but in these big kind of in the UK census where people are less likely to report it, maybe because they don't want to tell the UK government that they're trans, it's about 0.5%. And particularly these are younger people as well, where the rate is a little higher too. So what's amazing here is they looked at the experiences of gender harassment, unwanted sexual attention, and sexual coercion. Now, what was interesting is they had their cisgender participants, their strictly kind of binary transgender participants, and then their non-binary participants. And they found that in terms of gender harassment, about 8% of cisgender girls had experienced it, which compared to between 22 and 24% of transgender and non-binary participants. Unwanted sexual attention, 16% of cisgender girls, which is shocking and also not surprising. And then between 25% and 35% of gender diverse participants. So that's a huge amount, like 1 in 4 to 1 in 3, maybe a little bit more of gender diverse participants had experienced unwanted sexual attention. And then sexual coercion for cisgender women, 3.5%. And for transgender and gender diverse folk, between 9 and 12%. I say between 9 and 12 because the rates were slightly different for binary transgender people and non-binary folk, with non-binary folk experiencing a little bit more sexual harassment, but those differences are not statistically significant. So we can't tell that's not just a quirk of the data. So, still the difference between our gender diverse and cisgender participants was clearly very statistically significant and quite substantial in difference. So yeah, gender diverse folk in this study clearly at increased risk of experiencing sexual harassment. And Hatchell and colleagues took a look at the outcomes of that kind of sexual harassment victimization. And they found that sexual harassment victimization predicted increases in depressive symptoms, and victimization predicted lower levels of school belonging. And that also damaged the worsened depressive symptoms. So we find that sexual harassment both worsens depressive symptoms directly and damages school belonging, which also itself then worsens depressive symptoms. So again, in a sense, like other forms of victimization, sexual harassment is its own unique and very challenging form of victimization, but that communicates very significantly poor outcomes for the people who experience it, much like other forms of victimization. Pretty horrendous. Now, there is some good news here. Now, there's a cool study from Burkett and colleagues in 2015 called Does It Get Better? And they there was, I don't know if you remember the It Gets Better campaign, which was a campaign to kind of tell young people, please stay around, it gets better, for LGBTQ young people specifically. Now, Burkett and colleagues, I laugh because it's kind of brilliant. They looked and they were like, well, we made that claim that it gets better, but we didn't actually know if it got better, right? We didn't have any studies to kind of say, well, it definitely does get better. If it doesn't get better, then we might be doing harm by telling young people it gets better when actually it doesn't. But in their final sample of 231 participants, which were about half African American, only 34 white, 29 Latino, and 40 who identified as multiracial. And they basically, mean age at baseline, 18 years of age, roughly, nearly 19. Now, this was a time-lagged study, so they were looking at longitudinal follow-up. So they basically captured their participants once, and then they carried on following up with them on 6 occasions over about 3.5 years. Now, that gave them an opportunity to say, hey, does it get better over time? does psychological distress improve? Now, the first thing that we got to say is that, unfortunately, victimization was felt more like there was more victimization in African American participants than in white participants, which is interesting. And victimization was stronger in people assigned male at birth than in girls, and it was obviously stronger in transgender than in non-transgender participants. Not surprising really at all. And interestingly, though, they found in the time-lagged analysis that it did actually get better, which I think is really promising. So while people's experiences was obviously very challenging during adolescence, over time, their psychological distress improved. Now, basically what they found was that, psychological distress improved over time, but that was because victimization improved over time. So they found that, experiences of victimization beforehand was significantly associated with current levels of psychological distress, even when you control for prior psychological distress. So we know that victimization has this long-term effect on people's emotional distress. But that as young people got older, that victimization reduced, and then their sort of emotional well-being, or their depressive symptomology and their psychological distress improved. So the authors basically say that changes in victimization across development then drives developmental reductions in psychological distress from adolescence through young adulthood. Now, in a sense, that's quite positive. It does actually get better over time as people get into adulthood. Victimization reduces, people stop bullying each other, and that then improves sort of emotional outcomes. But that, in a sense, that's also quite problematic, right? Because if we could get a hold of victimization, if we could really reduce victimization in adolescence, reduce bullying, then we could improve the outcomes of these young people, I think, immediately. It seems that maybe we could do it. They shouldn't have to wait for it to get better, I guess is my point. So what do we know so far, then, in answer to Sajid Javid's question? It was a generous interpretation of the question, but what do we know so far? So we know that from these big meta-analytic studies, we know that young people, particularly gender-diverse young people, are at risk of victimization. We know they're also at risk of sexual harassment, sexual forms of victimization, and we know that these have a pretty deleterious effect on people's emotional well-being, particularly their sense of belonging, and it increases their risk of depressive symptomology, and it increases their risk of suicidal ideation and attempts, very sadly. Now, we also know that it gets better over time, and that's largely because adolescence is the time when victimization takes place most commonly, and victimization falls off when people get into the working world, into adulthood or into university. Victimization falls off a little bit, and that's where their kind of emotional well-being then improves. Now, there's an interesting study I wanted to kind of focus on here by Turban and colleagues. Yes, that Turban, and yes, we do love them so very, very much in this podcast. In 2021, it's called Timing of Social Transition for Transgender and Gender Diverse Youth, K through 12 Harassment and Adult Mental Health Outcomes. Now, this is really interesting. So again, this is the classic USTS cross-sectional non-probability survey of some 27,715 gender diverse participants across the US. Absolutely gorgeous study. Includes participants from all 50 states, as well as Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and the US territories abroad. Amazing. Now, they took a look at the experiences of young people and the age at which they engaged in social transition, whether they engaged in social transition as adults, aged 18 or over, whether they engaged in social transition in adolescence between 10 and 17, or whether they engaged in social transition in childhood between the ages of 3 and 9. And they took a look at the adult outcomes of those young participants, and they could make basically claims longitudinally about what the effects of the age of transition had on the emotional well-being of them as adults. Now, those three groups, really interestingly, those who started to live, who engaged in full-time social transition in adults, in adolescence, and in childhood, they got the stats on how frequently they experienced, how many of them experienced verbal harassment, physical, like bullying, physical attacks, and unwanted sexual contact. So like verbal, physical, and sexual harassment, essentially, or bullying or abuse, depending on the country in which you're conducting the work. Here they describe it as K through 12 harassment, and they could get a sense of the proportion of people who experience them. So those who engaged in transition in adulthood for the first time, only 23% experienced harassment, 13% experienced physical attacks because people thought they were trans, and 6% experienced unwanted sexual contact because people thought they were trans. Now, in the people who transitioned in childhood, those rates were much higher. So from 23% for verbal harassment to 50% experiencing verbal harassment, from 13% experiencing physical attacks to 26% experiencing physical attacks, and from 6.1% experiencing sexual contact, unwanted sexual contact, to 17% experiencing unwanted sexual contact. That's sort of, have they ever experienced that when they are following transition in childhood? So it's not that they experienced those things in childhood, it means that they had ever experienced those things after first transitioning in childhood. Now, in adolescence, those rates were even higher, generally speaking. For verbal harassment, 61% of people who transitioned socially in adolescence would go on to experience some form of verbal harassment. Physical attacks, 26%, and then slightly lower, 14% for unwanted sexual contact, but still much, much higher than for trans folks like me who transitioned in adulthood. Now, of course, if you were to take a look at that and be like, those harassment figures are kind of staggering, right? And what we also find is that people who transitioned during adolescence had a greater odds of lifetime suicide attempts, and they had a greater odds of past year suicidal ideation. So what we find is that their sort of emotional outcomes are much worse. So when we take a look at that on the face of it, you can imagine a world in which people might say, wow, transition in adolescence is associated with both like a lot more harassment, and it's associated with worse emotional outcomes. Maybe we should prohibit people from socially transitioning in adolescence. But here's where things get really interesting, and it's not going to be super surprising to you, I think. In their post hoc analysis, so they went back to the data after they'd seen the results and did a little bit more analysis. And they took a look at controlling for harassment, basically, based on gender identity. So they had a look, they looked at the more negative outcomes for people who transitioned in adolescence, and they said, what are those more negative emotional outcomes, the suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts, are those like the consequence of harassment by controlling for the experience of harassment? And they found that when they controlled for harassment, none of the associations with adverse mental health outcomes remained statistically significant. So they basically found that, yes, transition in adolescence is associated with worse mental health outcomes. But the reason is because when people transition in adolescence, they are exposed then to the victimization of out transgender folk, right? We all get victimized, particularly when it comes to adolescence, and being out increases that risk. So people who socially transition are at greater risk of that harassment, and therefore at greater risk of negative outcomes. And as we have seen, at least in part, that will probably be due to a deleterious effect on people's sense of belonging and self-compassion, primarily sense of belonging. So what in the world can we do? What do we do then? Like, this is a horrendous circumstance, clearly really problematic. And while more and more people are transitioning in adolescence, this situation is going to get worse. Now, as we've described before, the increased rate of people transitioning in adolescence is no bad thing. And it's like we've seen in that big meta-analysis looking across the United States, that weirdly in the Western states where there was kind of more liberal attitudes towards gender diversity and more people were out, they found worse situations for victimization. And that's likely to be the case globally, right? Where as we kind of get to a position where people are more welcoming of gender diverse folk again, bearing in mind that people were once more welcoming of gender diverse folk in our histories across the world. As we get to more welcoming circumstances, more trans folk are going to come out. But we aren't yet good at managing the victimization that then results, right? There increased risk of harassment, bullying, victimization, and of all kinds, like physical, verbal, and even sexual harassment, people experience more of as a consequence of coming out. So we sort of have this kind of nightmare, like perfect storm that's happening right now, right? Where we have a culture where more and more people are coming out and feeling, being okay to be their authentic selves openly in the world. But we have a circumstance in adolescence where victimization and bullying are still really prevalent. So these young people coming out may well be at increased risk of negative mental health outcomes, even though they're coming out into a broader society that is more welcoming, because it exposes them to such harassment in adolescence. Now, Carl, Greytak, Kosku, and Vilenas in 2016, they talk about what can we do, essentially. They looked at 21 studies in a systematic review of anti-bullying policies in improving LGBT youth's school climate. Now, they were looking at 9 peer-reviewed journal articles, 6 research reports, 5 doctoral dissertations, and 1 master's thesis. And together, they basically identified that sort of stronger policy, better policy elements did work to reduce verbal and physical bullying. So it might be something that we want to include, or we want to kind of do a good job of creating good, strong anti-bullying policies in schools. But they say you have to be quite careful to do this very well, because current policies, particularly in the States, might actually sort of be focused overly on more traditional forms of bullying, like physical and verbal bullying, and less on the social and relational bullying that we see more online and we see also interpersonally, but it's less apparent. And the problem that we found is that, these authors found that these kind of good anti-bullying policies still had difficulty tackling cyberbullying, tackling social and relational bullying, because apart from anything, they happened more frequently outside of school, and they happened more frequently outside of the eyes of witnesses, which made it difficult for school staff to tackle. So what do we do then? We need good, strong anti-bullying policies that cover all aspects of bullying and that really genuinely help to support against bullying behavior. Now, that's the content of a systematic review for sure, right? That right there, how do we do good anti-bullying policies? That's a whole systematic review all of its own that I haven't yet conducted. But I will say that there is one study that really does do a good job here. It's a UK study from Woods and Woolk. It was in 2003, so 20 years ago. But hey, the original Olweus studies were in the 90s, and Olweus's work is still referenced in anti-bullying literature and legislation. So, we need this good classic stuff is no bad thing. Their research does the content of anti-bullying policies inform us about the prevalence of direct and relational bullying behavior in primary schools. Educational Psychology. The journal is called Educational Psychology. Awesome. Now, they come up with a list of questions that schools can ask themselves when they're trying to work out, is our bullying policy good enough, right? Is it strong enough? And this is built out of the sort of Olweus 1993 studies, essentially. And they ask these questions. So these questions are questions that schools maybe can and should ask themselves about their bullying policy. Do we show evidence of awareness and involvement by adults on the subject of bullying? Does our policy define bullying? Do we acknowledge the repeated notion of bullying behavior? Do we acknowledge the intentional nature of bullying behavior? Do we acknowledge that it occurs in a relationship where there is an imbalance of power? Do we consider that bullying can be physical, verbal, psychological, and relational? Relational bullying, for people who don't know, is the manipulation of social relationships to exclude or isolate, or to reduce the kind of social capital of somebody. Do we as a school consider the possible deleterious outcomes of bullying behavior? For folks who don't know, bullying is one of the few things that can have a deleterious effect on people's learning. It's that and brain injury and epilepsy and bullying, right? So this is how important we need to consider bullying and harassment and victimization to be. Do we consider as a school the possible locations where bullying behavior can take place so that we can be aware of the different places we need to be mindful of when we're thinking about the potential for bullying? Right, at the school level then, do we as a school show any evidence of carrying out bullying surveys or questionnaires with children and young people in the school? Do we hold school bullying conferences for all involved parties before designing our anti-bullying policies? Do we acknowledge the need for improved supervision to counteract bullying behavior? And have we formulated a coordinated group for dealing with bullying? So this immediately shows that bullying policy is not something you can design in isolation, right? It's something that you need to liaise with children, young people, and parents to tackle together, because it happens at all levels and in all kinds of different places. Do we have, in terms of policy at the class level, class rules against bullying? Clear and explicit rules. Do we hold regular class meetings on the subject of bullying? And do we hold Parent-Teacher Association PTA meetings where the focus is on bullying? And at the individual level, do we show evidence of having serious talks with both bullies and victims following bullying incidents? And do we have serious talks with both parents and other students who might be bystanders, witnesses to bullying behavior about the bullying incidents? Also, whenever we're designing anti-bullying policy, we should also focus not only on the bullies and the victims, but also on bystanders, because bystander intervention is a really important way that we can tackle bullying. Not only members of staff, but also young people themselves. We can have in our policy and in our education, how do we teach people what they need to do if they see something like this happen? Should they intervene, or should they, as we probably will invite them to do, find an adult who can help? So this is what we need to do as a community, right? Together, we need to create anti-bullying policy. We need to create schools and colleges and universities, educational environments where young people can experience their authentic selves, can be free to be openly themselves without the risk of victimization and bullying. Because as we see, victimization and bullying is a disaster for these young people. And right now, as they come out more frequently in adolescence, they're at increased risk. And those risks have long-term effects. So we need to make sure that we create colleges and universities and schools at every level where everyone can find a place to belong. Thanks so very much for joining me. You are incredibly welcome here. This is Classroom Psychology. It's just great to see you all. I hope you're all doing well, and I look forward to seeing you as always in the next one.